Now, I am standing in the lobby of an apartment building that I own, holding a single sheet of paper, a lease with exactly one name newly changed on it, and waiting for the elevator to bring down the woman my husband moved into my property, so that I can welcome her, very politely, to her new reality. Then, 4 years ago, before any of this, I bought that apartment with my own money. It was mine, a small, smart investment. A thing I'd done quietly and well, the way I do most things. I never once imagined it would become the place where my husband, Victor, would secretly install his girlfriend and tell her I would learn this later that he had bought it for her. He hadn't bought anything. He had moved another woman into a home that belonged, completely and legally, to me. And he had been quietly using our money to keep the lights on in their love nest. This is the story of how I found out, and what I did with the one piece of paper that controlled all of it, the lease. Because Victor built a grand romantic gesture out of a home he did not own. And all it took to bring the entire thing down was changing one single name. But before I tell you, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Has someone ever taken something that was entirely yours, your money, your work, your home, and quietly handed it to someone else as if it were theirs to give? How did you find out? And what did you do? Be honest, because the most satisfying part of this whole story is that I didn't have to take anything from Victor. He had given away something that was never his in the first place, and getting it back was as simple and as devastating as a signature. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And before I take you back to the beginning, I want to say one thing to anyone watching who has a quiet feeling that something they own, money, a home, an account, a piece of their own hard work, is being treated by someone else as though it were theirs to use. Don't talk yourself out of that feeling. And don't let anyone make you feel petty for paying attention to what's yours. Knowing exactly what belongs to you, in your name, by your right, is not greed and it is not paranoia. It is simply refusing to be a stranger to your own life. The people in this story who got hurt were the ones who stopped paying attention to what was theirs. I almost became one of them. The afternoon I walked back into my own building was the afternoon I stopped. Then let me explain how I came to own that apartment. Because the ownership is the whole spine of this story. Years before I married Victor, I was careful with money in a way he never was. I saved, I invested, and at one point I bought a modest apartment across town as an income property, something in my name, bought with my funds. A little piece of security that was entirely my own. When Victor and I married, I kept it separate, the way you keep the things that were yours before. Over the years, Victor, who was charming and good at making himself useful in low-effort ways, offered to manage it for me, handle the tenants, the upkeep, the small stuff. And I let him, because that's what you do when you trust someone. I handed him the keys to a building I owned. I did not realize I was handing him the stage for his entire affair. I want to be honest about why I let Victor take over managing it. Because I think the reason is something a lot of people will recognize and quietly wince at. It wasn't that I was lazy or uninterested. It was that at a certain point in our marriage, letting him handle something felt like a small gift I could give him, a way of saying, I trust you, this is ours now. You don't have to feel like the guest in a life I built before you. He'd seemed almost wounded early on that so much of our security came from things that were mine. So handing him the apartment to manage was, in my mind, an act of generosity, a way of folding him deeper into my life. That is the cruelest part, looking back. The very thing I did to make him feel like more of a partner became the exact tool he used to betray me. My generosity was his opportunity. I have made peace with it now, but it took a while. Because there is a special kind of pain in realizing that your trust wasn't just broken, it was used as a building material. Now here is what those keys had become, by the time I found out. The apartment that was supposed to be generating income for me was instead generating a home for them. The tenant Victor had told me about, the one whose rent he said came in every month, did not exist. The unit was not rented to a stranger. It was occupied by a woman named Camille, my husband's girlfriend, who had been told that the apartment was Victor's, that he owned it, that he had set it up for the two of them. Meanwhile, I, the actual owner, had been quietly covering the building's costs out of our shared money, believing I was maintaining an investment. I was not maintaining an investment. I was subsidizing my own betrayal, paying the mortgage on the room where my husband was building a life with someone else. Let that arithmetic sink in the way it sank into me, standing in that lobby, because it is the coldest math I have ever done. Every month, money that I believed was maintaining an investment for our shared future was actually keeping a roof over my husband and his girlfriend. I was, in the most literal possible sense, paying for their relationship. The candlelit dinners they had in my apartment. The mornings they woke up together under a roof I was financing. He hadn't just cheated on me. He'd made me an unwitting sponsor of the affair. A silent investor in my own humiliation. And the genius, the truly galling genius of it, was that he disguised the whole thing as me doing something responsible and good. I thought I was being a careful steward of my property. I was being the patron of their love story. When I understood that, the last of my heartbreak burned off and turned into something much more useful. A very calm, very focused resolve. Then the way I found out was almost insultingly small. I needed a document related to the property, something only an owner would need, and so I went to the building myself one afternoon, for the first time in over a year, because Victor handled it. And as I stood in the lobby, the doorman, who did not know me by sight, because Victor had always been the face of the place, greeted me warmly and said, "Are you here to see Camille and Victor? Lovely couple. Such a nice apartment they have. Lovely couple. Such a nice apartment they have. In my building. That I owned." The floor did not fall away beneath me. Instead, something in me went very still and very clear, the way it does when a confusing picture suddenly resolves into perfect focus. If your stomach just turned at the thought of a doorman cheerfully congratulating you on your own husband's affair, hold on to that. But do me one quick favor first. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage. And your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is, tonight, about to discover what's really been happening with something she thought was hers. And believe me, what one name on a lease can do is the part you came for. Now, here is what I did not do. I did not go upstairs. I did not knock on the door of my own apartment and confront the woman living in it. I did not call Victor and scream. Because in that lobby, in that moment of perfect clarity, I understood the single most powerful fact of my entire situation, and it was this. I owned the building. Not Victor. Not Camille. Me. Every right, every key, every legal thread of control over that apartment ran back to my name and only my name. They thought they were living in Victor's romantic gesture. They were actually living in my property, at my discretion, on my dime. And the instant I understood that, I understood that I held all the power, and that the worst possible thing I could do was reveal that I held it before I was ready to use it. So I smiled at the doorman, and I said, "No, just here to drop something off." And I left. My hands were steady. My voice was light. Inside, a whole marriage was rearranging itself. But on the outside, I was just a pleasant woman declining to go upstairs. And I have never been more grateful for my own ability to stay calm under pressure. Because that calm bought me everything that came next. If I had let what I felt show on my face, the doorman might have mentioned it. and word might have reached Victor. And my single greatest advantage that they had no idea I knew would have evaporated in the lobby. So I smiled, and I left, and I carried the whole storm out the door with me without spilling a drop of it. And I went to see a lawyer. The drive home from that building was one of the strangest of my life because I was not crying. I kept waiting to cry, the way you brace for a wave you can see coming, and it never quite arrived. Instead, I felt almost weightless, almost clear. And it took me a while to understand why. It was because, somewhere in that lobby, my role had changed. For the length of that drive, I was no longer a wife who'd just discovered a betrayal, a passive thing, a victim, someone things happened to. I was an owner whose property was being misused, which is an entirely different kind of person. A wife who's been cheated on has feelings to manage. An owner whose building is being misused has options to exercise. The betrayal hadn't changed, but my relationship to it had. And the difference was the difference between drowning and swimming. I drove home not asking why he could do this to me, but asking what, precisely, I was going to do about it. And that question, it turns out, has answers. Then, I want you to understand who Victor had decided I was over the years, because it explains how he could be so careless. To Victor, I was the responsible one, the boring one, the one who handled the money and didn't make waves. He had so thoroughly cast me as the steady, unsuspecting wife that he genuinely believed he could run his entire affair out of a building I owned and I would never notice, because noticing wasn't my role. He had stopped seeing me as a person who could act. He saw me as infrastructure. And you can hide a great many things from infrastructure right up until the infrastructure remembers it has a name on the deed. I've thought a lot about that word, infrastructure, because it captures something true and awful about how I'd come to be seen, and I think it happens to a lot of capable, reliable people in their marriages. When you're the one who handles things, the money, the property, the logistics, the quiet machinery that keeps a life running, you can slowly become invisible in a particular way. Not unloved, exactly, but unseen as a full person. The way you don't really see the plumbing until it fails. Victor relied on me completely and noticed me not at all. He trusted the infrastructure to keep functioning while he lived his real life on top of it. What he forgot, what people like him always forget, is that the person holding everything together is not a system. She's a woman with eyes and a memory and a name on every important document and the capacity to decide on any given afternoon. To stop holding it all together for someone who's been using her as a foundation to stand on while he looked elsewhere. Now, so that is exactly what I did, and it is the calmest, most surgical thing I have ever done. My lawyer listened to the whole story, and then she laid out, very calmly, exactly how much power I actually had, and it was more than even I had realized. The first thing she told me, because the apartment was my separate property, bought before the marriage with my own money and kept in my name, it was mine, fully and cleanly. Victor had no ownership claim to it whatsoever. He had been treating it as his to give away, but legally he had no more right to install someone in that apartment than a stranger off the street. The second thing she told me, the woman living there, Camille, had no legal standing as an owner or a protected long-term tenant in the way she imagined. The arrangement Victor had created was informal, undocumented, and built entirely on his lie that the place was his. As the actual owner, I had clear, lawful options for how to handle the occupancy done properly, with proper notice by the book. And the third thing she said is the one that became the whole plan. She said, "You don't have to throw anyone out in a dramatic scene. You're the owner. You can simply formalize reality. You can put a proper lease in place in your name as the landlord with the actual occupant named as your tenant, at fair market rent payable to you." One corrected name on a lease, and the fantasy that this is their home becomes the fact that it is your property and they are accountable to you. Or they leave. Either way, you win. And you never raise your voice. I sat with that advice for a moment in her office, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. The deep, settling calm of knowing that the law and the facts were entirely on my side. There's a particular helplessness that betrayal produces, a sense that the other person, by breaking the rules, has somehow seized all the power, while you, who kept the rules, are left with nothing but your hurt. My lawyer's words dissolved that completely. Victor had broken faith, yes. But in doing so, he'd built his whole secret life on top of an asset that was unambiguously, legally, documentably mine. He thought breaking my trust put him beyond consequences. It had actually walked him directly into them, because every right that mattered still belonged to me. I didn't need to break a single rule to undo him. I just needed to use the ones I'd quietly been holding all along. Working entirely through proper legal channels, I had everything prepared. A formal lease, drawn up correctly, naming me as the owner and landlord of record, and naming Camille, the woman my husband had installed, as the tenant, responsible for fair market rent, payable directly to me. One name, changed on one piece of paper, and the entire architecture of Victor's grand gesture inverted. The home he'd given Camille became, on paper and in law, my rental property, with Camille as my rent-paying tenant, and Victor as nothing at all. People underestimate the power of doing things correctly, by the book, in the daylight, and I want to make the case for it. Because it's the heart of why this ended so cleanly for me and so catastrophically for Victor. I could have done something loud. I could have stormed up to that apartment, made a scene, screamed at Camille, posted everything online, blown my whole life up in a single satisfying afternoon. And every bit of that would have felt incredible for about an hour, and then would have handed Victor the gift of being able to call me unhinged, vindictive, out of control, to make my reaction the story instead of his betrayal. Instead, I did the most boring, most devastating thing available. I exercised my legal rights as the owner of my own property, calmly, with documentation, through proper channels. There was nothing for anyone to criticize, nothing to spin, nothing to point at. Just a woman quietly reclaiming what was always hers. Loud revenge gives the other person a way out. Quiet, lawful precision gives them nowhere to stand. Then, and here is where the now and the then finally braid together, in the lobby where this story began. Because before I delivered any of it, I quietly did the rest of what mattered. I stopped the flow of our shared money that had been subsidizing the place, no more invisible support for their love nest. I documented everything for the divorce I now knew was coming. The affair. The use of my property, the lie Victor had told Camille, the money he'd routed. And only when all of it was in place, calm and complete, did I go back to the building with my single piece of paper and ask the doorman to call down the woman living in my apartment. Now, Camille came down expecting, I imagine, a package. What she got was me. I introduced myself not as the scorned wife, not with any drama, but simply as the owner of the building she was living in. I watched the confusion cross her face, and then the dawning horror as the pieces began to assemble. Because she had been told the entire time that this was Victor's apartment, that he owned it, that it was their future. And here was a calm woman in the lobby explaining, gently and factually, that the apartment belonged to me, that it always had, that Victor had never owned a single square foot of it, and that if she wished to remain, she was welcome to, as my tenant, on a proper lease paying rent to me. I will never forget her face. Because it wasn't only the betrayal of learning Victor had lied about owning the place. It was the total collapse of the story she'd been living inside. The grand gift was not a gift. The man who'd given her a home had given her nothing. He'd simply moved her into his wife's property and let her believe a fairy tale. Every cozy evening she'd spent in that apartment, she'd spent in my apartment. Every time Victor had gestured around the rooms as though they were his kingdom, he'd been showing off something he didn't own. I didn't have to say a single cruel word. The lease said all of it. One name changed. What struck me most, standing there watching it land on her, was that I felt no urge to be cruel to Camille. And I want to explain why. Because it surprised me too. I had expected to hate her. I had expected the sight of the woman who'd been living with my husband to fill me with rage. Instead, watching her face fall as she understood that the home she thought was hers had never been real, I mostly felt the strange solidarity of one person watching another discover she'd been lied to by the same man. Victor had deceived her too, not in the same way he'd deceived me, but really, materially, he'd let her believe he was a man who owned a beautiful apartment and had given it to her out of love. When the truth was, he'd given her a tour of his wife's property and taken credit for it. She had built a fantasy on his lie just as I had built a marriage on it. In that lobby, I wasn't her enemy. I was simply the person holding the document that ended the fantasy for both of us. The lease was not a weapon I swung at her. It was just the truth, printed out. Then and now, fully joined. Camille did not stay. Of course she didn't. There is no romance left in a love nest once you learn it belongs, in full, to the wife. And that your continued presence requires writing her a rent check every month. She was gone within the week, and I suspect a great deal of her affection for Victor went with her. Because it is very hard to keep loving a man once you've watched his grand gesture evaporate into a lie told at your expense. She actually paused at the door, on her way out, and looked back at me not with hatred, but with something closer to recognition, one woman acknowledging another who'd been handed the same beautifully wrapped lie. She didn't apologize, and I didn't expect her to. But in that look was a shared understanding that we had both, in our different ways, been living inside a story Victor wrote and neither of us got to read until it was too late. Then she left, and the apartment was mine again, empty and quiet and entirely, finally, only mine. And Victor. Victor found out that his carefully constructed second life had been dismantled not with a scene, not with a screaming match, but with a signature and a single changed name on a document he never thought to read. When I finally told him I knew everything, and that the apartment he'd been playing house in had been reclaimed by its actual owner, me, I watched a man understand that he had built his entire affair on a foundation that had never belonged to him, and that the woman he'd dismissed as mere infrastructure had quietly owned the ground the whole time. He tried in that conversation to do the thing they always do to make it sound smaller than it was, to reframe, to find the version where he wasn't really the villain. He said I'd blown it out of proportion. He said the apartment thing was complicated. He said I'd gone behind his back by talking to a lawyer, as though consulting an attorney about my own property were the betrayal in the room. And I let him talk. Because I had learned by then that you don't argue a man like Victor out of his self-image. You simply decline to participate in it. When he finished, I didn't defend myself. I just said that the apartment was mine. That it always had been. That I'd reclaimed it through entirely lawful means. And that my lawyer would be in touch about the rest. There was nothing he could grab onto. Every accusation he tried to make slid right off, because none of them were true and all of mine were. That's the quiet gift of having actually done nothing wrong. You never have to defend yourself. You only have to state the facts, and the facts do the rest. The divorce was clean, because the facts were absurd in my favor. A husband who conducts an affair inside his wife's separate property, while using shared money to fund it, and lies to his girlfriend about owning it, does not hold a strong hand. I kept my apartment. Obviously, it had always been mine. I recovered the money he'd funneled, and I walked away with my property, my dignity, and the quiet, perfect satisfaction of a woman who never had to take anything. Because the other person had simply been caught giving away what was never theirs. I kept that apartment, by the way. I didn't sell it in some symbolic gesture, and I didn't turn it into a shrine to what happened. I simply put it back to the use I'd always intended: a quiet, sensible income property in my name, generating exactly what it was supposed to generate. For me. Every month now, it pays me a little, the way it was always meant to. The room where my husband built his secret life is just a nice apartment again, rented to a perfectly ordinary tenant who has no idea of its history, sending a check to its owner. There is a deep, unflashy satisfaction in that, in having taken something that was twisted into an instrument of betrayal and simply, calmly, returned it to being mine. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not as someone who got revenge, but as a woman who discovered her own home had been turned into the set for someone else's love story, it's this. Know what is yours. Truly yours in your name. Bought with your money. Controlled by your signature. Because people who betray you will often, without thinking, build their betrayal on top of something that legally belongs to you, assuming you're too trusting or too distracted to remember that you hold the title. The most powerful response is rarely a fight. Sometimes it is simply, calmly, exercising a right you've held all along. The people who truly love you will never hand your things to someone else as if they were free to give. The ones who do have forgotten whose name is on the paper. All you have to do is remember. And I want to add one more thing to that lesson. For the person watching who handles the responsible, unglamorous parts of their own household, the money, the property, the documents, the things no one thanks you for. Do not ever let anyone, including yourself, convince you that this work makes you small, or boring, or merely the support system for someone else's more interesting life. The person who knows where everything is, whose name is on the things that matter, who understands how the machinery actually works, that person is not the infrastructure of the household. That person is the foundation. And a foundation is the one part of a building you cannot betray without the whole thing coming down. Victor thought he was the house and I was the basement. He found out far too late that you can live very grandly on an upper floor right up until the owner of the foundation decides to stop holding you up. There's one more thing, though. A few weeks after Camille moved out and I took my apartment back, I found something she'd left behind in the unit, a box of documents that revealed the apartment was not the only thing of mine Victor had been quietly treating as his own, and that the lie he'd told Camille was not the first time he'd done exactly this. What was in that box, and what it led me to next, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.